Hi, it's Nicole. I've been reading The Mayor of Casterbridge for the last 2 weeks, and I've been asking myself and the novel a lot of questions. But by this morning when I have to press record, I still haven't got all of the answers. But it's okay, because I know Thomas Hardy spent month and month writing this novel. Is not for a mere mortal like me to decipher all the layers of meanings in 2 weeks. So I don't feel too bad not having all the answers. And even better, I have you guys here. I'm going to share with you my thought process and the questions I've been asking. I know a lot of you have been reading The Mayor of Casterbridge this month as well as part of the Victober group read, so I'd love to hear your opinions. First of all, what's the story about? It's the tragedy of Michael Henchard, who rises to the position of the Mayor of Casterbridge from a penniless farmhand and then falls to disgrace and a miserable death. And it's also the story of how, after committing a terrible crime against his wife and child, Michael Henchard tries to restore his family ties. It has one of the most unexpected opening chapters of any Victorian novel I read so far. I was walking when I listened to the first chapter, and I had to rewind a few times to make sure I heard things right. 21-year-old Michael Henchard got drunk, humiliated, and sold his wife Susan and newborn baby Elizabeth Jane in a tent full of people, like auctioning cattle, to a complete stranger for 5 guineas and 5 shillings. When Henchard woke up next morning, he was ashamed of what he did last night and set out to look for them. But before he went, he made a vow in a village church nearby and swore upon a Bible not to drink alcohol for 21 years. 18 years passed between chapter 2 and chapter 3, and Susan's sailor husband died at sea, so that's the man who bought her. So the mother and daughter found Michael Henchard to be the prosperous Mayor of Casterbridge. Henchard was glad to find his wife and daughter alive and well, but in order to live his shady, headstrong and disgraceful life as a young man absolutely unopened, meaning to keep his reputation as a town mayor and church warden, and to keep Elizabeth Jane's affection towards him as a father, Henchard and his wife kept their past a secret from their daughter and the world, and they married again. Henchard has never been happier in his lonely life. The word lonely is repeated many times in the text. The problem of his loneliness was now solved. He had a wife and a daughter installed in his big empty house. But the author describes these 2 women like some kind of furniture added to Henchard's house. There is very little love involved. He pressed on the preparations for his union, or rather reunion, with this pale creature, that's Susan, in a dogged, unflinching spirit, which did credit to his conscientiousness. Nobody would have conceived from his outward demeanour that there was no arbitrary fire or pulse of romance acting as stimulant to the bustle going on in his gaunt great house. Arbitrary means relating to or induced by sexual love or desire. Nothing but 3 large resolves. 1, to make amends to his neglected Susan. Another, to provide a comfortable home for Elizabeth Jane under his paternal eye. And the third, to castigate himself with the thorns which these restitutory acts brought in their train. Among them, the lowering of his dignity in public opinion by marrying so comparatively humble a woman. Castigate means rebuke, so the third is to rebuke himself severely with the thorns, which these restitutory acts, that means the acts of making good or compensating for loss, damage or injury, in this case making good for what he did to Susan. People think he's doing it for love, but there's no love, only 3 large resolves. There's also self-righteous in the last sentence. A mayor marrying a poor widow and adopting her daughter. Even though she might pull him down socially, even though no one knew his shady past, he still decided to marry her. It was his duty to correct the wrong. How noble. Another example, lest she, that's Susan, lest she should pine for a deeper affection than he could give, he made a point of showing some semblance of it in external action. Among other things, he had the iron railings that had smiled sadly in dull rust for the last 80 years painted a bright green, and the heavy barred, small-paned Georgian sash windows enlivened with 3 coats of white. He was as kind to her as a man, mayor, and churchwarden could possibly be. The house was large, the rooms lofty, and the landings wide, and the 2 unassuming women scarcely made a perceptible addition to its contents. He doesn't genuinely love Susan. He paints bits of the house to give the outward appearance of care and affection. Look how much the mayor loves his new wife. He even painted the railings and windows for her. Notice how his external actions is literally on the outside of the house for people to see. He couldn't give the deeper affection a wife deserves. Again, the last sentence is telling. The 2 unassuming women scarcely made a perceptible addition to its contents. They are like furniture to him. It's fitting for a mayor like him to have a respectable big house. It's fitting for a mayor like him to have a wife and a daughter, and that's all they are to him. That seems to be the case, at least at the beginning. You might think it's unfair of me to say Henchard didn't love Elizabeth Jane. As long as he thought she was his, he provided for her and was fond of her. But as soon as he found out she was not who he thought she was, he hated her and drove her out. But when he did love her again, a lot later on, he did it with such intensity, it was painful to watch. His love for his stepdaughter, I think, far surpassed his love for both women who either was or nearly was his wife. I think it was the sorrow of losing Elizabeth Jane that in the end killed him. So the first question is, what does Henchard want? At the beginning of the story, he thinks he wants a family. When he gets one, or the appearance of one, he doesn't value it very much. But later on, when he loses absolutely everything, he realizes the importance, the value of family. But by that point, it's too late to have one. When I was rich, I didn't need what I could have. And now I be poor, I can't have what I need. Let's go back to an earlier part of the novel for a little bit. Even better than his family, who were largely ornamental, Henchard gained a new friend, Farfrae, who was travelling on the same night that Henchard recovered his wife and child. This is how Farfrae is first described. He was ruddy and of a fair countenance, bright-eyed and slight in build. Now, here's the second question. Does this description remind you of someone? Farfrae did Henchard a huge favour and was very modest about it. Henchard took an instant liking to this young man. I feel you would be invaluable to me. That needn't be said. And if you will bide and be my manager, I will make it worth your while. Farfrae refused. Well, I shall get a manager somewhere, no doubt, said Henchard, with strong feeling in his tones. But it will be long before I see one that would suit me so well. After this conversation, Farfrae went down to the pub and joined in the general entertainment of the evening by singing a few songs. We see the scene from Elizabeth Jane's eyes. Elizabeth Jane was fond of music. She could not help pausing to listen, and the longer she listened, the more she was enraptured. She had never heard any singing like this, and it was evident that the majority of the audience had not heard such frequently, for they were attentive to a much greater degree than usual. They neither whispered, nor drank, nor dipped their pipe stems in their ale to moisten them, nor pushed the mug to their neighbours. after reading George Saunders' book on Russian short stories, especially the one on a singing competition, it's natural to see that this is Hardy's way to say Farfrae is an excellent singer. When Farfrae was singing in the pub, Henchard was listening outside. When the Scotchman sang, his voice had reached Henchard's ears through the heart-shaped holes in the window shutters and had led him to pause outside them a long while. To be sure, how that fellow does draw me, he had said to himself. I suppose 'tis because I'm so lonely. I'd have given him a third share in the business to have stayed. Henchard liked Farfrae very much, as you can see, and pressed him again and again. And finally, he persuaded him to stay in Casterbridge and made him his business manager. Now, again, does this remind you of someone or a story somewhere? A master takes an instant liking to a humble young man and gives him a high position, a very prominent position in his service. And another hint, the young man is very skilled with music. Henchard was not the only one who took an instant liking to Farfrae. There was a mutual affection between Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane right from the beginning as well. This gentle, modest young man won many people's heart very quickly. Henchard, who had hitherto been the most admired man in his circle, was the most admired no longer. Henchard had this conversation with a child. Why do people always want Mr. Farfrae? I suppose because they like him so. That's what they say. Oh, I see. That's what they say, hey? They like him because he's cleverer, Mr. Henchard, and because he knows more. And in short, Mr. Henchard can't hold a candle to him, hey? Yes, that's just it, sir. Some of it. Oh, there's more. Of course there's more. What besides? Come, here's a sixpence for a faring. And he's better-tempered, and Henchard's a fool to him, they say. And when some of the women were walking home, they said, he's a diamond, he's a chap of wax, he's the best, he's the horse for my money, says they. And they said, he's the most understanding man of them two by long chalks. I wish he was the master instead of Henchard, they said. Henchard murmured, wish he were master here, do they? Whenever he thought of Farfrae, it was with a dim dread. Henchard raised this young man up, and now he was outshining him. Henchard heard the unreserved praises from these women of Farfrae, and their opinions of Farfrae was way higher than their opinions of him. They wished Farfrae was the master instead of himself. Henchard was jealous and worried that his kingdom of Casterbridge was going to be taken away by Farfrae. Does that remind you of someone or a story somewhere? It was at this point I thought, hang on a minute, this is the story of Saul and David in the Bible. And it came to pass as it came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. Exactly the same thing is happening here. Thomas Hardy even makes sure it's the women specifically who are doing the praising. Going back and looking at all the things we've noticed so far, Jonathan, who is Saul's child, loves David immediately, just like Elizabeth Jane, who is Henchard's child, loves Farfrae at first sight. And this is how David meets Saul for the first time. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, that's David's dad, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favour in my sight. In exactly the same way, Farfrae found favour in Henchard's sight and became his business manager immediately. And while Farfrae can sing, David is a man who is a cunning player on a harp. Cunning means skillful, just in case you are wondering. I don't use King James Version of the Bible very often. I'm using it here because reason one, I reckon that's probably what Hardy would have used. And reason two, do you remember how Hardy describes Farfrae when he first introduces him? He was ruddy and of a fair countenance, bright-eyed and slight in build. And how is David described when we first meet him? Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to. These are not all the parallels yet. Later on, as Henchard got more and more jealous and resentful towards Farfrae, dangerous thoughts entered his heart, just like so. Who was to warn Farfrae? You guessed it, Elizabeth Jane, the equivalent of Jonathan. So naturally, a follow-on question would be, why does Thomas Hardy make Henchard and Farfrae a bit like Saul and David? Is it to foreshadow that it is unavoidable that Farfrae will take over Henchard's kingdom and everything, and that Henchard will die in the end? There's another interesting parallel a bit later on. Henchard locked up the church band and choir in a pub and forced them to sing Psalm 109, specifically verse 10 to 15. Psalm 109 is one of the strongest of the imprecatory psalms, according to Christopher Ash. Imprecatory psalms are psalms that evoke judgment, calamity, or curses upon one's enemies. It's difficult to understand and it's a bit shocking to read. Psalm 109 is written by David. His friend has turned into an enemy and he asks God to judge them. There are a few such candidates in David's life, and Saul is one of the possibilities. So why does Henchard want the choir to sing this psalm specifically? He seems to think he's the injured party like David, and Farfrae has repaid evil for good and hatred for his friendship like Saul. Psalm 109 verse 10 to 15 is a series of curses. Henchard bullied the choir into singing that psalm, and therefore he thought cursing Farfrae. But to my eyes, I think the curses have largely turned on Henchard himself. He lost his wife Susan, his good friend Farfrae, he lost the title of the mayor, his reputation and honor, he lost his second chance to have a family, and he was bankrupt, and he lost his business, his house, his livelihood and home. And he ended up working in the yard with among the workers who he once was the master of. As soon as the 21-year vow ended, he was drunk and depressed, and finally, when he was reconciled with Elizabeth Jane, he genuinely loved her and couldn't bear losing her. Somebody came along and took her away. And here's the last thing I want to ask. Why is the world in this novel so cruel? My constant reaction throughout reading this book has been, why is Thomas Hardy so merciless? Everything that could go wrong went wrong, and everything that could happen against Henchard happened. We said earlier, Henchard wants family. The other side of the coin is, what does he fear? And I believe it's loneliness. Susan, Farfrae, Lucetta, Elizabeth, all had gone from him, one after one, either by his fault or by his misfortune. The whole land ahead of him was as darkness itself. There was nothing to come, nothing to wait for. Yet, in the natural course of life, he might possibly have to linger on earth another 30 or 40 years, scoffed at best pitied. The thought of it was unendurable. The thought of enduring loneliness for the rest of his life drove him to committing suicide. Henchard was lonely but bold at the beginning of the novel. He was desolate and crushed at the end. Does Hardy have no feelings towards his characters? As his creatures, does he not love them? I believe he does. According to one biography, apparently Hardy was deeply affected by the story, telling a friend that this was the only tragedy that made him weep while writing it. I've been reading a very educational book called How to Read Literature Like a Professor. There is one chapter on violence, and it talks about two categories of violence in literature. The specific injury that authors cause characters to visit on one another or on themselves. And the second type, the narrative violence that causes characters harm in general. The first would include the usual range of behavior, shootings, stabbings, but the second, authorial violence, I mean the death and suffering authors introduce into their work in the interest of plot advancement or thematic development, and for which they, not their characters, are responsible. The Mayor of Casterbridge is so full of both type of violence, so much so that even the character-on-character violence make me not to question the motivation of the injuring party, but the motivation of the author. Because either Hardy arranges some busybody to review Henchard's disgrace from the past, which is a character-on-character violence, or Hardy directly orders the weather to ruin Henchard's investment, which is a authorial violence. There are too many coincidences to be coincidental, and they are never accidents to the author. For example, when the sailor appeared immediately after Henchard started to love Elizabeth Jane, I didn't think, why did the sailor appear then? Because obviously the sailor appeared because the author decided he should. I didn't think, was the sailor a nice person or a wicked person doing what he did? I skipped over the character and immediately thought, why did Hardy bring him back at this point? On one level, in terms of the plot, you can say it was to create another unfortunate coincidence and to tear Elizabeth Jane apart from Henchard and to cause his exile. But on a deeper level, why does Hardy do that? Throughout the whole book, I feel like I was watching the author destroying a human being, bit by bit, blow after blow, until he was on the ground and not moving anymore. I was really depressed by the hopelessness and the helplessness of it all. The universe of the Mayor of Casterbridge is random, unkind, and indifferent. And what does that say about Thomas Hardy as an author? Is he a kind creator? Is he a kind person? Does he really believe, as he concludes the novel, that happiness was but the occasional episode in a general drama of pain? If I were a fictional character, I would not wish to be one under Hardy's pen. Let me know what you think. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.